Welcome to the Atheist Podcast. I'm Erin.
And I'm Kelley. Atheist is where we will explore American cultural trends through the lenses of a devout theist
and a devout atheist. We will discuss the messiness of being human,
the latest in social science, psychology, and American culture,
and what any of it has to do with Homo sapiens' longtime preoccupation with religion.
Hey, Erin.
Hey, Kelley.
How are ya?
I'm good. How are you doing?
I'm great, because we have pretty much my best friend in the whole world on the show today. And we are not just interviewing her because she's my best friend in the whole world, but because her work is actually incredibly relevant to what we talk about on this podcast. So today we have Cathleen Falsani, who is an award-winning religion journalist, photographer, and author. Her books include, and go out and buy all of them, The God Factor, Inside the Spiritual Lives of Public People, Sin Boldly, A Field Guide for Grace, The Dude Abides, The Gospel According to the Cohen Brothers, and Belieber, Fame, Faith, and the Heart of Justin Bieber. And she's also co-edited a few books, one called Disquiet Time, Rants and Reflections on the Good Book by the Skeptical, the Faithful, and a Few Scoundrels, and also The End of Hunger, Renewed Hope for Feeding the World. So Kathy and I are both Connecticut natives, and we went to college together, and we also both just did the Living School program together at the Center of Action and Contemplation, which was awesome to kind of get to study alongside Kath again. So Kath, thanks for being here.
Super, super happy to be with you and to see your smiling face in the window when you're so very far away. And it's so nice to meet you, Erin. I've heard so much about you.
Yeah, very nice to meet you. Thank you for joining us.
It's my pleasure.
Kathy is joining us all the way from Ireland, which
Yes.
is her new home.
It is.
Kathy is a kind of newly knighted Irish
minted.
citizen.
Let's say minted. They don't go for knights
okay.
over here.
Okay.
Newly minted Irish
yeah.
citizen. Yeah.
Newly minted Irish citizen, and she and her husband Maury, who's also a journalist, live there in a beautiful part of the country, and I can't wait to get over there. So Kath,
Kel,
I'm super excited to talk to you about this, and I'm super excited for Erin to get to talk to you also, because you know the bent of our podcast is about kind of making connections, fostering connections, and you know Erin and I kind of have a lot of connections, but the one thing that we that is different for us is, I'm a theist and she's an atheist. And so much of your career as a journalist, in fact, kind of the driving kind of
focus
of your journalistic career has been finding connection between people in spiritual ways. So I guess my first question for you is, where did that come from? What's the spark of that, where you started to interview non-religious people about kind of spiritual matters?
So gather round, children, and I'll tell you a tale about I'm channeling Eliza, what's her face, about landlines. So many moons ago, when I was a graduate student, I went to graduate school at Northwestern for journalism, to be a print journalist for mainstream secular newspapers. And I also, at the same time, was a student at a seminary studying basically comparative religions. I wasn't there to be ordained. I was part of the Great Unwashed, the MTS, the Master of Theological Studies. And the whole idea was to train me to write about religion in the mainstream press,
Mhm.
and specifically in Chicago, where religion is, a sport. Um, so I was lucky enough to have one of my professors, Roy Larson, who taught at the seminary and at the journalism school. Um, early on in my studies, never mind career, said he called it the God factor, that religion, spirituality, faith, whatever you want to call it, is actually happening everywhere if you look for it right. And that if you were the religion reporter for a newspaper or for a broadcast channel or for NPR or whatever, but I was a print person. So if you were a religion reporter for a newspaper, if you did it right, you had the biggest beat at the whole paper. And that to me was really exciting, because I didn't want to read about the Southern Baptist Convention's latest
Yeah.
platform about whatever. Like I wanted to know why Bruce Springsteen's Ghost of Tom Joad makes me cry. Like what is it about that? What is it about
Mhm.
going to a baseball game that gives you the Jesus chills? Like why do those things happen?
Yep.
And that's the way, and I was really, really lucky. It took some convincing, but after a while, I got to a newspaper where I had editors who just let me do that. And so I talked to people, not about dogmatic things, although that did occasionally come up, but that was like 2% of the time. Most of the time,
Mhm.
I talked to them about what gave them meaning, why they were passionate about the things that they were passionate about. And I also found that, take the Cohen Brothers, for instance. Um, People are generally speaking not kind of meh about the Coen Brothers. They either love the Coen Brothers or they
Mhm.
don't like it's Wes Anderson, same thing. They love them or they
Yeah.
don't. So the things that people are like passionate about, to me, if you start sort of chipping away at the surface of what that might be, you get to something that is more universal and more is essentially spiritual. Why did I look at the world that way? Um, I think I was wired that way. That I have an early memory. My parents, who my mother was always a very religious person of various flavors over the years in the Christian context, but always a very religious person. My father, who was more cerebral, but had a very sort of squishy, and he was an intellectual and an educator, and a scientist, but he was had these experiences with the sacred that were almost describable. He would just move them to tears. So that was those were my parents, and they had lived all over the world before my brother and I were born. So my house was filled with my mom had lived in Japan, so we had a lot of Japanalia. My parents met in Germany, so we had all stuff from there. My father had traveled, extensively through the ancient world, and I remember this. It wasn't an encyclopedia, it was Time Life books, which again, gather around children. There used to be these books on a given subject. It was sort of like I don't even think kids know what Wikipedia is, so we won't even go there. So it was a slim volume on a subject,
Mhm.
and it was a slim volume, and I have it. It's actually in the shipping container somewhere between California and Dublin at the moment, but this very slim volume of the Time Life book of world religions. And I have this really, really vivid memory of myself, probably 3 years old, like, those formative early memories, sitting on the floor in the family room, looking at pictures of giant Buddhas in Japan and whirling dervishes and, people doing the Hajj and, um, pictures from inside us. I wouldn't have known then, but I know now, a Sikh Gurdwara and, pictures from the Vatican and other places. And just being fascinated with why people were doing what they were doing. And each of the pictures, in some fashion, showed illustrated devotion, whether it was a Thai woman on her knees crying into her hands in front of a giant Buddha, or men circumambulating in white during the Hajj in Mecca, or an altar that had supposedly the remains of some saint somewhere in some church somewhere in Western Europe. Um, and I remember asking my mother at the time, who was then would have been extremely Catholic, which is a brand, by the way, TM, extremely Catholic. I pointing to the woman crying in front of the Buddha and saying, Mommy, why is she crying? And I think she said something, my memory of the answer was something like, she's crying because she really wants the statue to give her something, but the statue can't give her what she wants. It was something like that. And I remember being like, huh, that's weird. But
Yeah.
just being fascinated by, like, why do people do what they do? Why do people choose to live the way they do? Why do people spend money the way they do, invest their time and their talent and their passions and their finances and things that they do?
Yeah.
Why do people treat other people the way that they do? How do they understand their relation to other people? And then how do they understand their relationship to what some of us call the divine, or something that's bigger than ourselves, to God, to the great unknown, to the universe, whatever it is. So I tried to put all of that, which again, 25, 30 years ago, I don't know why I would have had quite the same language for it that I do now, into writing for a daily newspaper where, and I was at the Chicago Sun-Times for a large portion of my career, and that was a tabloid newspaper. That's not the style of reporting, it's just the size of the newspaper, which means that generally speaking, it was shorter. So I had to fit like big, all of the stuff was always undergirding whatever I was writing, whatever I was trying to communicate, whatever story I was trying to help other people tell. And I had to get it into like 500 words, or, if I was lucky, 800 words, or when I eventually had a column, 1,200 words, if I got a pushover editor who didn't cut stuff. So, that's what I did. And that compelling, why do people live the way they do? Why do people, and it's not even why do people believe the way they do? Because I
Right.
care less about the believing and more about the living.
Yeah.
That still compels me all the time, professionally and personally. So that was a very long answer to, and
Yeah.
stammering answer to, a fairly simple, straightforward question.
No, but I don't know if I've ever really heard that. That answer. And the God Factor, and that's the name of your first book.
I forgot
Yeah.
that it was that's where it came from. I think we
Came
called
from.
it started as that book in earnest started as a series in the newspaper.
Okay.
Newspapers used to have sweeps like television, and again, gather around children.
Yeah.
Television used to have channels, not streaming services, that, once or twice a year they would run special things to try to get the most viewers. And newspapers kind of have the same thing. And so one of my editors said to me, I think it was in February, for whatever reason, the shortest month was when we were doing these sort of sweeps. And they said, we want you to do a series for whatever we called it, sweeps. I was like, great. What about? And they're like, religion. I'm like, yeah, that's on my business card. Like, what?
Yeah. Yeah.
And they're like, oh, I don't know. And so this is 2004. And about 18 months before that, I had talked my way. This actually relates directly to Kelley. I had talked my way onto a tour bus that at the time, Bono, the lead vocalist of U2, was taking across the American Midwest in the middle of the winter, or the beginning of the winter, with a bunch of activists to try to get the American Evangelical Church essentially to respond to the AIDS crisis, the AIDS emergency in sub-Saharan Africa. And I only knew that he was getting on the bus because Kelley called me, because her
Because
sister was
my sister told me,
Live
right?
Nation, right? She was working at Live
Yeah.
Nation at the time in the contracts
Oh.
department. And she's like, Bono's going on a bus tour. I'm like, Bono's not going on can I swear?
Yes.
Yeah.
Bono's not going on a fucking bus. He has gone on a bus in 20 years. There's no way. And it, so I did a little digging and turned out that, yeah, he was getting on a bus, but it wasn't the band. It was him doing this activism thing. And this was the early days of Data, which was the forerunner to the One campaign. And so, to make a long story short, I talked my way onto the bus as the religion columnist for the Chicago Sun-Times, knowing, because I'm a huge U2 fan and have been since I was 12, that he hadn't really spoken about his faith, which I knew was a really compelling, probably the central compelling focus of his life. Um, he hadn't talked about it publicly at any depth for a really long time because he'd
Yeah.
gotten burnt a lot for certain Christians. He wasn't Christian enough for anybody. For a lot of other people, he was holier than thou. In his own home country, where I'm sitting at the moment, he couldn't win either way, and so
Yeah.
for a time there, he just stopped talking about it. He
Yeah.
just stopped talking about it. So I had a hunch that the whole reason he was getting involved in sub-Saharan Africa had something to do with Jesus, and I was right. He wasn't trying to convert anybody. He was trying to save lives, people who were dying because by virtue of where they were born, and because they were poor. So
Yeah.
I asked if I could come and write about the efforts that they were doing and write about the tour from that vantage point, and hoped that he would open up and trust me, and he did. And I think it was 10 days on the road altogether. Um, and it was running off the front page, and people were really fascinated to hear,
Mhm.
arguably one of the biggest rock stars in the world talking not just in passing about faith, not just making a remark about Jesus, but like talking in depth about things like grace and
Mhm.
Yeah.
justice and how he understood that now as opposed to how he understood it when he was younger. And it was fantastic. And, so when they said, "We need you to run," so I thought, "Okay, well, part of why people found that interesting is because I was talking to somebody who you wouldn't, especially then, necessarily think to ask about," I'm using bunny quotes, "religion." It was that juxtaposition of the
Yeah.
unexpected, and
Mm-hmm.
so I thought, "Well, let's do that again. Let's try to do that again." And I like doing that, and I'd done a little bit more of it. I'd done some of that before Bono. I'd done some of that after Bono and before this Sweeps project. But, we were in the middle of I think there was a Senate, well, I know there was a US Senate race going on for the seat in, that Chicago is in. And I think there was a mayoral race and stuff. So we asked, I don't know, 10 leading politicians, sitting senators, Congress people, the mayor, who's very Catholic, Mayor Daley at the time. And they were all, not only was it no, it was like, "Hell, God, fuck no." Like,
Yeah.
"No,
Yeah.
no." There's no upshot to that.
Really?
Oh my God, they were terrified. They were like, "No, God, no." Like, "What? No, no, religion is personal." All the Catholics said, "Oh, religion is personal." That's not something that's not part of my public life. I was like,
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, I don't really buy that, but all right." And then I asked this one guy who was running for the Senate seat, um, from Illinois, from that, you know, well, one of the two Senate seats from Illinois, and his name was Barack Obama.
Mm-hmm.
And this
Yeah.
is, it was in March, I think, of 2004. So this is 5 months before he spoke at the Democratic National Convention. Everybody knew what his name was.
Yeah.
And we had a remarkable, once he said yes, it shamed all the other people that he was running
Mhm.
against into doing it
That's
too.
so interesting.
But his was the very first one that ran in the series. And then
Mm.
we opened it up to all kinds of other people. And I love music. Music is one of the places where I experience the transcendent, where I, have peak experiences where I find meaning and the ineffable in a really powerful way. And so, and again, all those words I wouldn't have said back then, but this is what it is. And so I wanted to talk to musicians. People are, like, "Do you want to talk to this star, or that star, this actor, that actor?" And I love actors, Kelley, you know this.
I know,
But
I know.
but but musicians was really, so we started doing some of that, and yeah, and it eventually took me out to California. And if you can believe it or not, the same year that I'd spent, like, I don't know, at least a month at the Vatican covering various things, I also went to the Playboy Mansion and had a very long conversation with Hef about God, about what he believed and why, and what he didn't believe and why. And it was one of the best conversations that I've ever had with anybody. And yes, all the
That's
things, but yeah,
that's
Yeah.
that's one of my favorite chapters in the book
mine
is
too.
your conversation with Hugh Hefner. Do you want to tell us kind of, because
Why?
he's
Yeah.
well, he's resistant to kind of,
Well,
he doesn't want to equivocate like what you believe and he believes, and
well,
then you find this
he's used
connection.
to, people had been asking, Hef, now of blessed memory, but he had people have been asking him about religion for decades. This was not his first rodeo. And so he had sort of a set
Stock.
script of what he
Yeah.
was going to say.
Yeah.
And in fact, somebody I know really well had been interviewing him the week before, or close to when I talked to him. Somebody who had a much more pronounced perspective and who was a clergy person, and so therefore was more invested in saving Hef's soul.
Mhm.
But a really great guy who used to be a journalist. And he was a little more confrontational with Hef. And my whole point when I proposed doing the series, and then the book was based on the same premise, was that I didn't want to do gotcha, you're wrong, that's stupid.
Mm.
I wanted to give people, the same way I did with Bono, a safe space where they could actually talk about what they believed without somebody being like, you're wrong. That's not actually
Right.
what it's. I mean, that was not my job in this format. And I did it. These were all done, I think, as a columnist and not as a reporter, which was slightly. I mean, there were much clearer delineations back then than there are now. It's just a free for all. But I wouldn't insert my opinion or my perspective in a news story. But if I was writing as a columnist, and I used to do both, I was very clear when I had the columnist hat on that you're going to hear some of me, and you're going to hear some of
Mhm.
my opinion in there. So when we did it in that context, it wasn't meant to be, let's get Dick Durbin to talk all about, why he does this or that. Senator Dick Durbin, who was one of the people that was in the series at the beginning. I think he was in the book too, although I can't remember. It wasn't to be a corrective. It wasn't to be a gotcha kind of a thing. It was just like, let's actually have a conversation about this, because it's much more interesting when people open up and trust you. So
Yeah.
with Hef, um, he asked, I asked, he said yes very quickly. And they're like, get on a plane. And so back in the day when they would do that for,
Yeah.
for not breaking news stories. And I went out there, and I always try to, and this is something I still try to do, not only as a journalist, but just, as a human, when I'm meeting somebody new in particular, I try to, as best I can, to leave my preconceived notions at the door and not assume I know anything, even if I've done my homework, and I always did my homework. But like just because it's been written, just because somebody else has written about it before, just because
Yeah.
you've heard them say this quote, doesn't mean that you actually know. You're having a new encounter, you're starting from scratch. So that's sometimes more difficult to do than others. But when you pull up in front of the Playboy Mansion, and I was much younger at the time, and there are literally signs as you're driving through the wooded, windy road that leads up to the very, iconic Playboy Mansion that say bunny crossings. And I'm like, oh God. And then he comes out and he's wearing the outfit. And I'm like, Jesus. And they have me waiting for him in a room where I'm sitting in front of, on like some crushed velvet settee, in front of the naked porcelain bust of Barbie Benton, like right in front of her
Oh my
boobs. They're
God.
right
Oh
here.
my God.
And, there are playmates around. And he comes down, and I really am just like, put it down, put it down, put it down, put it down, just meet him where he is. And so I ask him, the very first question I asked of every one of these interviews, from the newspaper through the book, was, how would you describe yourself spiritually?
Mm.
And I spent a long time thinking about how I wanted to ask these things, because I wanted to start them all the same way, so there's sort of a level playing field. And that's an
Yeah.
open-ended question. You never want to ask a yes or no question as somebody interviewing, because that's just bad to begin with, because it sort of shuts it down. It's binary, and so you don't get anywhere with that usually. Um, and when I asked that question, some people would give me a one-word answer, and some people would talk for 45 minutes.
Yeah.
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 And so in Hef, if memory serves, was like, um, well, like, and he started to give this sort of rote answer that he usually gives about being, I think, he was literally from the Mayflower. I think his family came over on the Mayflower. So he was a Puritan. And so he starts
Mm.
giving this sort of stock answer. And I also, and this is still true, I try not to manipulate and guide people in interviews. I mean, some of that is, I mean, I know I have 45 minutes, or I have a half hour, or I have an hour, or I have 2 hours, or God forbid it's open ended. And then, 3 days later. But I know I have a certain amount of time, and sometimes you have to, I mean, it depends on what the purpose of the interview is. If you're getting a point of information, then you kind of hit and go. And if they start to wander, you bring them back. But this was meant to be more open-ended. And so we're like 20 minutes into the conversation, and I'm just getting very astute answers from a man who's thought a lot about religion and been asked about it a lot, but I'm not getting the heart of the person.
Yeah.
And so I did something that I normally wouldn't do and that I still don't do. I interrupted him. And I said, "What's the most spiritual film you've ever seen?" And I knew that he was a film buff, but I didn't know much more than that. Or I said, what's your favorite film about religion, or something like that? And he went, well, like the epics. And I went, "Can I tell you mine?" And he said, "Sure." I said, "Harold and Maude." And I still remember his face completely changing. And he goes, "Oh, well, if that's what you're talking about, that's a whole different thing." And then it cracked him wide open. I had
Yeah.
no idea he knew Ruth Gordon and her husband. I had no idea that he was still such a good friend of Bud Quartz, who plays Harold in the film, who had just
Yeah.
been at the mansion for their
Yeah.
Casablanca nights. Like, I had
Yeah, he
no
used to go
idea.
there all the time, right?
Yes,
Yeah.
and still was back then. It was
Yeah.
just, this is jeepers, 20 years ago. That's insane. Um, wow, it is 20 years ago. I'm 1,000. Anyway, so that moment of it did a few things in retrospect that I thought, when I feel that like tug, that impulse to be a disruptor in an
Mhm.
interaction, in a conversation, I listen to it more than I would have. Um, because that was exactly the right thing to say. And that question did not come from something I had planned. That was, I
Mhm.
would say that was spirit recognizing spirit and saying, say this. And that was absolutely true.
Mhm.
I think it was, "What's your favorite spiritual film?" That's what it was. So he starts talking about, Moses and Ben-Hur,
Yeah.
and I'm like, "Harold and Maude." And he's like, "Oh." And then at one point he stops me and he goes, "Do they know how you are?" Like, "Yeah, they do."
I
So
love
yeah, and then we
that.
had this great conversation, and it was poignant and fascinating and um, really vulnerable.
Yeah.
And I loved that conversation. And that's
Yeah.
a cherished interaction. And yeah, he's all the things, right? Yes, he exploited
Yes.
women, and yes, yeah, but he also did a lot of other things that were really, really good and well-meaning, and in trying to change the world for the better, trying to introduce more freedom into people, more liberation into people's lives. And yeah, so I still, again, it's in the shipping container somewhere, but he sent me a thank you note because he was a very polite man, and very gentlemanly, even in his smoking jacket and cravat. Um, but I mean, he was like 85 when I talked to him. He was like
Mhm.
somebody's pop. Um, but yeah, he sent me a thank you, and it's framed and it's been in my office ever since. It usually hangs
That's
right over there, but it's like, somewhere in the Atlantic or Pacific at the moment. So yeah, so
Well, that
that taught me a lot. And that was it was 20 years
yeah.
ago. I learned so
Yeah.
much from that millisecond choice to interrupt him and ask a question.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
And
just
that
be
and
open.
that's the essence of finding connection, right?
Yeah, right.
That's what you were looking for. You weren't looking for stock answers. You were looking to find a connection.
Yeah, the thing. The
And
thing we used
the
to play. Do you
thing.
remember that, Kelley, when I was working on the book, we used to play this sort of parlor game because I pitched like half of Hollywood and every musician you could think of, and like all kinds of writers, and most of the actors said no, and I understand why, at a
Mhm.
more deep level now than I did then, because they're not about who they are; they're about what they're playing, and so talking about religion is just a lose-lose for most people. You're going to
Yeah.
ostracize some portion of your whatever.
Mhm.
Um, and a lot of them are just not used to talking about themselves. They can tell you what they're wearing, but they don't want to. I mean, that's not why they get into it. But musicians, on the other hand, they open a vein and they sing about it. And so
Yeah.
I would
So
do that.
I'm just gonna read the list of, now I know the God Factor, there you have other books. This is your first, but this has this list of the people, and I'm just gonna name some of the people that Kathy's interviewed here. So
Leave out the
we
ones
already-
that have been Me Too'd, because there's a few.
Oh, yeah.
Couple.
Yeah. So Bono, Hugh Hefner, Sandra Bernhardt, Stubbs Terkel, Barack Obama, Anne Rice, Billy Corgan, David Lynch,
That's another favorite.
Tom Robbins, one of my favorite. John Mahoney, who I think maybe we'll talk about that. John Patrick Shanley, also incredibly generous artist, right? Al Sharpton.
You found his email for me, which is the only reason he's in the book.
He publishes his email in his bios, in his
right.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
And he actually answered it.
He does. Yeah. Annie Lennox.
Yep.
Mark Morris, the choreographer. Jeffrey Sachs. Sherman Alexie, Harold Ramis, Russell Simmons, Michael Gerson, Dr. Henry Lee, Melissa Etheridge, jazz musician Kurt Elling, and Eli Wiesel. Just kind of amazing. Do you want to talk to us a little about the John Mahoney interview?
About John? Yeah, John is. I mean, it's hard to pick a favorite child, but John's chapter in the book is probably my favorite, because of what happened. So John was a neighbor of ours in Oak Park, Illinois.
Do you want to remind people who he is? So
John Mahoney was probably best known as the dad on Frasier, but was also a very celebrated.
Right.
Yeah,
okay.
Also a very celebrated stage actor. He was part of Steppenwolf. He was also the guy who gets a drink thrown in his face in Moonstruck in the restaurant, who then hits on Olympia Dukakis. He's the dad in Say Anything. John was in loads of films and loads of theater and television over the years. But so I first met him when I was working at a restaurant in Oak Park the year after we graduated. So, I was 22. And it was a seafood restaurant and bar, and there was a section of it that used to be kind of the elbow. It was like way in the back near the kitchen, and they had booths. And John lived across the street, and he used to come in occasionally, sometimes with a script, and he'd sit way in the back, and he'd read the script, and he'd have, his fish dinner and, a drink or two. And everybody left him alone. And it was I want to say it was like a Sunday night, sort of late, slow. And I go back and I think maybe I cleared something off his table, and we made eye contact, and he had this wonderful smile. And I said, I keep wanting to ask you about how your hip is. That's what it was. Because in the show, Frasier, he has a bad hip because he was a cop and he had been shot. And he had this great laugh too. He just, oh my God, that's great. Usually people ask me about the goddamn dog, because he also had a dog in the show. So that was the first time I had any interaction with John. And then years later, I married this man who also lived in Oak Park, and John was his uncle by marriage. So my late mother-in-law was a twin, and her twin married John's sister. And so that's how, so it's just sort of like an uncle-in-law, right?
Yeah.
And I think my husband first met John when my husband was like in junior high, and John was like maybe 20. And he remembers what he was wearing because he was so cool looking back then. And this would have been like the early 60s. Khakis and a white shirt with like or white t-shirt, maybe with like the something
rolled up.
And,
kind
of. He was cool. Anyway, so when I married Maury, like I knew that, and I knew that we were still living in Oak Park, and then we would run into John every once in a while, and Maury would say hello, and we would talk, and I knew he was a fan of my columns. Every once in a while I would hear, or he would like walk up to us in a restaurant and be like, I saw your thing about whatever, and that was beautiful. So when I was working on the book, because I think I'm almost, yeah, no, he was part of the book. He wasn't part of the newspaper, even though he was Chicago based. I asked him. I didn't want to put him out, but we were talking about it one night, and I think he even offered. He's like, "Would you want to talk to me for that?" I was like, "I didn't want to. Yeah, I'd love to. I didn't want to, put you in a weird situation." He's like, "No, I'd love to. I love your writing. I think it's brilliant. And sure, anytime." So, as actors do, he also spent a lot of time in Ireland in the summers. He would come to Galway, which is on the other side of the island from where I am at the moment, and come to their theater festival and do a play or two in the summer. And so, time passed, and I think it was turning into time for the book to almost be done. And we were finally both back in town at the same time. And so he said, "Why don't I meet you at this little, like, um, it wasn't a diner, it was like a sandwich restaurant kind of thing that was literally 2 blocks from my house and maybe 4 blocks from his." And I said, "Sure." I didn't even, like, prepare because I knew John's story and I knew John a bit, and I, again, asked the same, "How would you describe yourself spiritually?" And I didn't get Irish Catholic as the answer. I got a much more, nuanced answer. And then it went places that I didn't expect it to go. And then it was beautiful, and John was a incredibly kind, loving, um, gracious, thoughtful, brilliant person. And so it went down along those roads, and he told me some really compelling stories that I don't know I haven't seen them anywhere else, let's put it that way.
Hmm.
And he talked about, like, the parish that he would go to in the city and why he went to that one, and he didn't really go to mass, but he'd go to pray and what that meant to him. And so we're heading into the end of the interview, and this is where I learned one of the other things is don't shut the tape recorder off until the other person is out of your sight. And
Yeah.
I'm so glad I didn't. Normally, I would have packed up and just been ready to go. So I got up to go to the restroom, and when I came back, he had gotten up to pay the bill. I think that's how it worked. It might have been the other way around. But anyway, I was sitting at the table. He came back, and I could tell by his face that something was on his mind. And he literally said to me something that my husband, who's a very fancy award-winning journalist who is my senior and had taught me as when I was a cub reporter, is that when you're having a conversation, when you're doing an interview, like this, and you ask somebody something, and then there's an uncomfortable silence, the best thing you could possibly do is to say nothing, because when there is that uncomfortable silence, the person that you're with is trying to decide whether they should tell you the thing that they really want to tell you, but they're afraid that they shouldn't.
Mm.
And so I didn't turn off the tape recorder, and John sat down and had this weird look on his face, and I didn't say anything. And he said to me, "I've been trying to decide if I want to tell you something or not." And then he told me something deeply, deeply personal that wasn't religious necessarily at all, that I don't think he'd ever shared with anybody else. And it spoke to a felt need in his life and a wound of a kind or a longing of a kind that on the surface isn't necessarily spiritual, but that the way I understand the world is deeply, deeply, deeply at its essence, at the deepest essence, spiritual. And talked about it it was moving, and it wasn't like, he didn't out himself or anything like that, but he talked about something that he didn't need to tell me. And he had just decided for whatever reason in that moment that he was going to share with me and therefore with the world, or at least the, 14,000 people or so who actually bought a copy of the book when it first came out. And the lesson I learned from that, which was maybe 6 months after I talked to Hef, they sort of bookend each other, was, um, try to leave your preconceived notions at the door and meet people where they are and pay attention to those little pulls that say, maybe you should say this, not the ones that are interrupting the flow, but the other kind. With John, it was be careful of your preconceived notions and your assumptions. Be careful if you think you know somebody before you have these conversations with them, because you might not. And I didn't. And I learned stuff from John that's precious to me, especially now that he's gone. And he said some things about how he understood God's love. Um, about there's nothing we could ever do essentially that would make God love us more or less. That is one of the things I've heard as a takeaway from the book from readers over the last 20 years, or the last, close to 20 years, more than anything else. You know, that part where John Mahoney says this,
Yeah.
it's like, yeah, I do. Because it sort of changed the way I thought about God, the way I thought about sin and forgiveness and redemption. And he also, and people may disagree with this, and I don't really care, because he clearly didn't. Um, it's something along the lines of, I think Anne Lamott said something like this too in one of her early books. You have a choice to be right or to be kind sometimes. And it's
Yeah.
always better to be kind than to be right. And he was talking about, he was an orderly, I think, in a convalescent home or something. And there was a woman who she was dying, and she'd always wanted to have red hair. And the nurses or the orderlies dyed her hair, and one day, and she was absolutely delighted with this bright orange, kind of clownish, as John says, hair. And she was just, she was a woman in her last days, and she was in pain, and she was dying, and she was just thrilled to finally be a redhead. And her daughter came in and shamed her, essentially. And John remembers her saying, "Well, I have to tell her the truth." And he said, "Do you? Do you really? Is that is to be right in that moment? Is that better than to be kind to your mom? How hard would it have been to just say, 'You look beautiful'?"
Yeah.
So there's truth, and then there's truth in our interactions. And I mean, yeah, it's always better to be truthful, but not always, I suppose. If the choice is between kindness and righteousness or rightfulness. So, but
And
yeah,
there's
that all of that came from a sandwich with somebody. I thought this was I had half of it written in my head before I even talked to him.
Yeah. Yeah.
So those things happen
love
if you
that.
leave space for them to happen. They can happen, at
Yeah.
least.
Yeah.
So, yeah. So when I interview people now for various things, and I still do from time to time, um, all of that comes with me, but more so, uh, especially in the last, 5 to 10 years, I think about it when I'm just interacting with people, when I'm meeting somebody. I'm naturally, um, I am an introvert who plays an extrovert, basically, and so I'm not. I have to push myself. Might not look like I do, but I do, to introduce myself to somebody, and I don't like small talk and all that kind of stuff. But I've learned that if I'm fully present, and in all of those conversations in the book, I was fully present. And that was before I was even practicing mindfulness in any structured kind of way. But if you're present for them and you're actually listening to what they're saying when you ask them a question, or even when you don't ask them a question, often it's the things that we don't ask that people offer that is really what's going on with them. And if I can give them the grace and the gift of that kind of attention, not only do connections happen that we might not otherwise make on our own, um, but the person goes away from the interaction, even if it's like at a checkout counter, um, feeling at least a tiny bit more cherished in a world that can feel really alienating and uncaring. That last bit, how it's a gift. It's not just about what information can I get out of it and how is the correct way for me to behave with people. And it's that it's doing something for them, for me to listen
Mhm.
and be present with them the way I do. And more often than not, that being present and listening means not saying much at all.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And just being with them. So
So all, this decades of, doing these interviews and gleaning this kind of wisdom, what are you shared the one from the book, but what are like some of the other maybe anecdotes that readers have reacted to or reached out and said, this really meant something to me?
so from that, this is a conversation I never had. Um, which is a weird thing to say about when asked a question about interviews. So this is an interview I wanted and didn't get, a conversation I wanted to have in a particular way that never happened. So when I was working on The God Factor, which was my first book, my publisher was an imprint of Farrar, Straus and Giroux in New York, which is one of the great houses. I remember, just as an aside, if there are any like literary nerds out there, like me. So, and I'm like Forrest Gump. The whole way I got a book contract and how that whole thing happened was just very Gumpian. And most of the best things that have happened in my life have been because I didn't know who I was talking to and didn't care. I just kind of came in as me. And then later somebody goes, by the way, did you know who that was? What the fuck? No, I didn't know. And if I had known, I probably would have been too self-conscious to begin
Nervous
with.
or yeah.
So I wound up at this like storied, literally storied, literally storied, literary house in New York, and with this incredible editor, Sarah Crichton, who's a legend. And I was in New York and I was visiting her in the office, and I had to go to the restroom. And so she's like, let me show it to you because you'll never find it. This is before they moved, they've since moved offices. And it was a warren of mismatched, sort of rusty old um, metal file cabinets and mixed match furniture, and still had windows that like actually opened with a sill. This is right off of Union Square in New York City. And she was walking me toward this bathroom that I would not have found on my own. And just as I was about to go in, she points to the filing cabinet and she goes, "Look." And it says on the drawer, Rilke. Ah! I mean, this was one of the publishing houses that published Rilke, and right outside the ladies' room was the file cabinet that had.
Jeez.
I was like,
Oh my
"How
gosh.
on earth did I get here?" Anyway, so I was sitting in her office, and the head of the house at that point, Jonathan Galassi, came past, and I think from just having talked with her socially, she knew the answer to the question when she asked me. She said she called Jonathan and she said, "If you could interview anybody for this book, who would it be?" And I must have said this in front of her. And I said, "Oh, that's not a question. Seamus Heaney, the Irish poet." And again, Forrest Gump over here did not realize that not only did it was Faber and Faber, a imprint of Farrar, Straus and Giroux. Jonathan Galassi, who was sitting next to me, was Heaney's editor. And so he says, if he doesn't do email, but if you write a letter and print it out, I'll fax it to him in Dublin. And I'm like, peeing my pants beside myself. And so I write this, I'm sure somewhat cloying, but true letter. And a few weeks go by, and I'm back in Chicago, and I had taken a sabbatical from the newspaper, and I'm to work on the book, and I'm at home, and the phone rings, and it's the secretary or the manager from the newsroom, and she says, "You've got a fax here for you." And I said, "Who's it from?" She goes, "Well, it's from somebody in Ireland." I'm like, "Don't tell me what it says."
Yeah.
Like, I'm coming in right now. And I come in and I get this fax, and it's, I think, 3 pages. And the first page, and this is printed in the book, but it's all of this entire exchange is printed in the book, but it says
Yeah.
something to the effect of, thank you so much for your kind invitation to talk to you. Give the best of luck with the book project. Unfortunately, spirituality or faith or whatever word he uses is something that I'm woefully inarticulate about. So I'm not going to be able to agree to an interview. I'm not going to be able to give you an interview, but so I'm like gut punch, like, oh no, the one I
No,
really
yeah,
wanted. And then
yeah.
the next paragraph, so you always have to keep reading because the story is not over. Um, he says, but perhaps what I've attached might be useful somewhere in the book or elsewhere. And I turn the page and it's a poem, an unpublished poem that he had given me to include in my book, Seamus fucking Heaney, my favorite poet in the world. And it was this gorgeous poem that is about faith. There it is. You want to read it, Kelley?
Yeah, you want me to read it?
Yeah, I do. Because you've got a better voice than me today.
A found poem. Like everybody else, I bowed my head during the consecration of bread and wine, lifted my eyes to the raised host and raised chalice, believed, whatever it means, that a change occurred. I went to the altar rails and received the mystery on my tongue, returned to my place, shut my eyes fast, made an act of thanksgiving, opened my eyes and felt time starting up again. There was never a scene when I had it out with myself or with another. The loss of faith occurred off stage. Yet I cannot disrespect words like Thanksgiving or host or even communion wafer. They have an undying pallor and draw like well water far down.
Yeah. Which I can't even hear you read without tears in my eyes. And woefully inarticulate, my arse.
Yeah,
Um,
right.
uh,
Yeah.
so that, I mean, there's so many things I could say about the gift of that and being able to tell that story in the book and to share it again over the years here and there and with his family, in fact. And um, that was, that's the gift that keeps on giving. That's the sort of don't don't take no for an answer, but sometimes take no for an answer, but read the fine print.
Mhm.
Um, and it's also sometimes the conversation you need to have is not be is the conversation you need to have with the other person is not the way you think it's going to happen. It's not
Yeah.
actually, it's maybe not with words, it's maybe not between
Mhm.
the two of you directly. And I want to tell if I can a story related to that.
Yeah.
That poem and that chapter in the book. So my book comes out, first book, and I'm new to everything. And again, Forrest Gump, I don't know any. They don't really brief you. One of the things I do is that uh, these days is I'm a literary creative consultant, and I work with a lot of first time authors and tell them things that I wish somebody had told me when I was a
Mhm.
first time author. And one of them was like, book tours are not all that you think they're gonna be. You've never felt, the exquisite sadness and pain, um, quite as deeply and profoundly as you have the first time nobody shows up for your book signing. So,
Mhm.
I'm on a book tour. Like, I had just been at the, Los Angeles Book Fair standing next to Joan Didion. Do you remember that night? I was like, how the hell?"
What?
I'm like,
Yeah.
"There's a tiny woman next to me," and then my eyes focus, and I'm like, "Oh my god,
Oh.
Tom Wolfe is over there." I'm like, "How the hell did I get in this room?" Anyway, so I'm in California, so this is like a week or so later, and I'm in Marin County, and I have a book signing scheduled, and I get there, and there are all these cars, and I'm welcomed, and they give me a welcome bag, and it has my own I still have some of it, my own embossed stationery, and I'm like, "This is the high life." And I go past the crowd, they're taking me in, that I think is waiting for me to another room, the crowd was waiting for a children's author, and 4 women were waiting for me in the other room. And so I had this moment of like, kill me,
Deep
but
humility.
but like, or just sort of like free fall, like,
Yeah.
okay, but there are 4 humans that I don't
Yeah.
know who
That's
Yeah.
showed
right.
up for this.
Yep.
And instead of like getting up and doing a reading and stuff, I'm like, let's just talk. And so
Yeah.
we did. And so one of the women, if she's listening to this, please get in touch with me because I would love to know what's happened in the intervening years. If I remember correctly, she was a woman who was middle age, probably the age I am now. We are now, Kel. Um, who was gay and I think Irish Catholic is her background, and who left the church when she came out, not because they threw her out, but because she felt like it would be hypocritical, or maybe they threw her out, but she felt like she wanted to go back, but she wouldn't let herself because she thought it would be hypocritical or she would be untruthful or something. And it was his poem and that
Mhm.
line about like well water far down.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember her tears coming to her eyes talking about that, and I was like, "You gotta listen to that." And you can't listen to the voices saying that you're not allowed to be there because you are. And I
Yeah.
hope she went back, and I hope that she's found some kind of fulfillment and connection and all that, but that was and I had this connection with this woman whose name I don't remember.
Mhm.
I can picture her face, and all of that from, an interview I didn't get,
Yeah.
and this
Great.
profound thing that came out. And that was meaningful to me, and then it has been meaningful to, I'm assuming, far more people than I even know.
Yeah.
And also from a book signing that, you know, on the outside, you know, was maybe
A
meager,
failure,
but
best book signing I've ever done. The
right.
best book appearance I've ever done. And I've done, ones where there were a lot more people than that. And I've done a few where there were that many people, but it was at a corporate, oh my God, there was one I did in Georgetown. Ugh. It was at the top of an escalator. And there were like 4 people, and there's always at least 2 people there who maybe have some mental health issues, and I'm doing my best, and up the escalator come, like, 3 of our guy friends from college who all live in DC, and they're so excited to see me, and they're so proud of me, and they come up the escalator, it's like the Trump entrance in reverse, and I'm, like, by myself sweating because there's, like, nobody there, and the people who are there haven't read the book, and I was just mortified. So but that in Marin in 2006 was the best
Was the
book experience
best.
book signing I've ever had.
Yeah.
Oh,
Bless
I
her.
love that.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
But
you actually have a connection with Erin. I
I
don't know
do.
if you remember this. Yeah. So Erin's aunt, you interviewed several times in Chicago.
Oh, wait, was this the women church woman?
Yes. Yeah. Linda Piazinski. Mm-hmm.
Yes. Oh my God, that's like early reporter days. That was when
Yep.
I learned how to spell Polish last names because I had to spell
Right.
hers all the time. Yeah. Oh my
Yeah.
gosh. Please, is she still with us?
She is. Yep.
Please
Yep.
give her my
She listens.
best.
Yeah, I will. I will. She does
Oh
listen to
my
the show. I'll
God.
make sure that she listens to
Hi,
this
Linda.
episode.
My God, I was at the Daily Southtown. It was my first reporting job. And that's when the first time I talked to her was when I was the religion reporter at a suburban newspaper before I was at the Sun-Times.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
no, I
She was a
remember her.
powerhouse.
Oh, yeah, she sure was and is,
Yeah.
I would imagine
Yeah.
still.
Yeah,
Um,
she is. Yep.
oh, that's crazy. Now I do remember you saying that, Kelley. Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Small world.
Yeah,
Small,
because
small.
I think when we were interviewing her, I think Kelley, you put it together, and
I
then
was like, did you know? And she was like, oh, yeah.
Yeah.
She's
I
like,
mean,
I
she
called
was
her all the time.
like in my Rolodex, which I
yeah.
just got rid of when we moved here. I had one of those big
Uh,
ass Rolodexes. She was definitely in my I had the alphabetical section and then I had like the go-to ones that she was in that section. She had
yeah.
was in like the daily or the weekly calls section.
Wow.
Oh,
Amazing.
wow. Mm,
I love
I
your
love that.
drink that has like the floral. Is it bait? What do you have in there?
So that's mint from our garden.
Oh,
Our
nice.
and a clementine, and there's a mixer over here. Um, that I discovered the very first day I was in Ireland. I came in through Belfast, and one of my cousins lives in the north. I'm very close to the border with the north of Ireland here, and I'm not a big gin person. I don't drink that much anymore anyway, but I'm not a big gin person. But every once in a while, especially when you're in like sort of British or Irish settings, it's sort of like what a lot of women drink. And I'd been traveling for like a week and a half. We traveled by ship and then another ship with my dog who doesn't, Elaine Stretch, who doesn't fly. And it was a whole thing. So I got there, I was exhausted, like, and my husband's cousin Conrad says, could I make you a drink? And I'm like, I can't have whiskey. I just can't. He's like, no, we've got gin and this, it's local gin. So this is a mixer. It's clementine and mint spritz
Okay.
Ooh.
from the supermarket, Lidl, LIDL. And it's not sugary at all. And it's like, and I just remember taking a sip and being like, Conrad, this is the best gin and tonic I've ever had in my
I've ever
life.
had. Okay.
It's very light, very refreshing. So that's what I haven't had anything to drink all week. I just finished some work, just went on a walk down to see the swans, and it was just warm enough that I'm like, gin and tonic. So that's what that is. So it's
Yeah.
a little slice of clementine, a sprig of mint from our garden, and clementine and mint spritz from a little supermarket.
Amazing. Well,
Thank you.
Kelley, we'll have to go to Ireland and check
Yeah,
it
because you
out.
can't get it over there. You can
Right.
only get it
Yeah.
here.
So, Kath, I have another question. If you
I
could
just saw your
interview-
face, and I'm like, uh-oh, what's she gonna ask?
Uh-oh. It's a.
You do know me better than 97.5% of
this
the
is a
world's
softball.
population. Okay.
Well, okay. So I have a softball, and then I also have like maybe a little bit deeper question. But the softball is, if you could interview anybody today, who would you interview?
Oh. If I could have a conversation about such things with anybody
Yes. Yeah.
that I would share in written form or something with somebody else.
Correct.
Um,
For the sweeps. I mean, not necessarily.
for the sweeps. Or let me think about that. I usually have somebody right on deck, but most of the people that I wanted to interview have left us recently. So I never got to have a conversation. I met him, but I never got to have a proper conversation with Desmond Tutu. Would have loved that. David Bowie. Let's just name all the dead people that I'm sad about. Tony, Tony Bourdain.
Oh,
Prince.
yeah.
Almost got Prince for the God Factor. Almost got him. Because he was,
Really?
yes, almost got him. Got very close to Prince. Which would have been such an interesting interaction, I'm
Yes.
sure. And I would absolutely not have been the person in charge of that one. I know there's somebody better, well, not better, somebody like perhaps more profound than this, but one person, just because I love how there's two people.
Okay.
And they both happen to be actors, weirdly enough right now. This is three that are coming to mind. Mark Maron, who I'm completely obsessed with, the only podcast, sorry guys, that I listen to religiously is his. And he's another person. I love him as an actor. I love him as a stand-up. He's a terrific writer. He has a couple of memoirs that are great. But he's the OG podcast guy. I mean, he started doing it before they were called podcasts. And I think he just celebrated 19 years last week.
Wow.
Oh my gosh.
And he's somebody who, like you, Erin, would say that he's agnostic or an atheist and doesn't have any religion doesn't do anything for him. And yet, every interview he does comes back to something spiritual. Always.
Yeah. Yeah.
He's deeply, deeply curious about it. And he just tends to bring people into that part of the conversation for whatever reason. And I think perhaps because he self-identifies as a skeptic, and I actually think, I would never try to patronize Mr. Maron, but maybe more curious than skeptical. He asks such great questions and he listens so well. So I would love to have a conversation like the God Factor conversations with him about himself. And I'd also like to have a conversation with Mark Maron about these things about myself, where he interviews me. I would love to be
Mm.
interviewed by somebody who does it as well as he does. So that's one. Another
Mm.
person that I think of is Nick Offerman.
Mm.
Oh yeah.
Uh, there's something about him and the way he moves through the world, and I'm a fan of his writing and obviously a fan of his acting, and um, the deliberate choices he makes publicly and the things that he tries to promote, and I just find him fascinating.
Mhm.
And I don't find most Midwestern men, don't tell my husband, fascinating, but I I I like the cut of his jib, and I think there are deep waters there.
Yeah.
You know, when your two best friends are George Saunders and Jeff Tweedy, you got something going on
Yeah.
that's beyond just something artistic. So those are two, and the other one that I thought of just recently, and he was on my list years ago for the God Factor, but I hadn't thought about it until Nathan Lane.
Mm.
I would love to talk to Nathan Lane about his experience of being a queer person and moving through. I think he was. I'm pretty sure he's Jewish, and I think I remember something about like a maybe particularly religious childhood, or that he comes from.
Mm.
There's orthodoxy somewhere in his, and just moving through the world of theater and then fame and then just being sort of an icon.
Mhm.
People who are iconic. It was fascinating to talk to Sandra Bernhardt, because like,
Mhm.
how do you? I mean, she's described in the book as iconoclast,
Yeah.
you
Hmm.
know. But somebody like, I mean, I think Nathan there's a soul for this. I started to say this before, Kelley, when I was when you might remember this, Kelley, when I was working on this book, we had this like parlor game. Anytime I
Oh
had
yeah.
dinner with you, it was like, who would you want to talk to about this book? And it was sort of like Tom Cruise or John Travolta.
Oh.
And you'd go, well, John Travolta. And there's like, well, why? It's because there's like a soulfulness, there's like a
Uh-huh.
vulnerability. Matt Damon or Ben Affleck?
Yeah.
Matt Damon,
Matt
right?
Yeah.
Damon.
Yeah.
Okay. So
Yeah.
there's like these
Oh, I
unspoken,
love
there's an
that.
openness, right? So
Yeah.
the three that I just mentioned um, are sort of that, like, you wouldn't necessarily think, but there's
Yeah.
something there.
There.
Yeah, I just named three white
Yeah.
men. Well, two of them are Jewish. So I I I I would
Well,
love to have a
the
conversation like this with Pope Francis, because I've spent so much time around him. I was there when he was elected, and I was there, literally in Vatican City, and I admire him a lot, and I think he would actually give honest answers instead of scripted
Mhm.
answers. Um,
Mm.
I would find that really, really compelling. I wish I could have talked to Mary Oliver before she left.
yeah.
Oh man.
She was right up there.
Do you know the story about Mary Oliver and the frog in her pocket?
I don't know if I do. I feel like I should.
So I was taking a class, a Theopoetics class last year, and I forget exactly who it was, but she was speaking in Chicago. She was giving a lecture. I want to say at Loyola or Northwestern.
Hmm.
Um, and oh, and it was Christian Wyman. Christian Wyman was, I'm not sure exactly why he was in, I'm pretty sure it was Chicago though, because it
Okay,
was
so
freezing.
my mind is going, she was in Chicago and she gave an interview to somebody, it wasn't fucking me. What? That's where the ego goes with that. It's fine.
But she was giving a lecture, and it's freezing, and she has this big coat on,
Tiny lady,
and
big coat.
tiny lady, and they're walking, and there's a frog. There's like a dead frog on the street,
Oh,
and she just stops and she picks it up and she puts it in her pocket, like her pocket. And it might have been like I don't know if it was her overcoat or whatever, but anyway, she goes to the lecture, and the story is, and I think Christian Wyman writes about this story, um, and she gives the whole lecture with a dead frog in her pocket.
Does she reanimate the frog with her magical
With her
Provincetown powers?
magic. I know. But, like,
I
is
love that.
that the most Mary Oliver
Yes, it is.
story
And
of
I picture it as a very heavy wool Mackinaw with like the slider, like elk
Yeah.
bone buttons.
Yes.
And so as you were saying that, and I was trying to be present and listening to you because I love that story, and thank you for that. I remembered who it was it was the number
Oh.
one person on my list. It was very,
Oh.
very obvious, Kelley. Who do you think it is? The person that I'm completely obsessed with, that I've read everything she's ever written. I've gone to every show I could possibly go to, and I've never interviewed her about this.
Yeah,
Patti Smith.
Patti Smith, yeah.
Patti Smith. Patti Smith, if
Yeah.
you're listening.
Yeah, she would be number one for sure.
Darling Patricia, she would be, and honestly, one of the few left on the roster of rock of musicians that have been so meaningful to me that I would want, that I
Yeah.
haven't had a chance. I'm really privileged in that I've had a chance to talk to a lot of them and meet a lot of them and have like, not just like, hi, how are you? I don't want to, I used to say years ago, I don't want Bono's autograph. I want to take him I want to go to church with him. And then I did, like literally like
Yeah.
the second day I knew him. But I don't want to just meet people. I want to have conversation with them, like a deep conversation. And Patty, dear Patty, that's the one. That's the
And
outstanding
you
one.
saw her, didn't you see her in? I mean, I know you've seen her several times.
My first show my first show in Ireland since we moved here was at Victory Street in Dublin. Yeah,
because she plays in Ireland all the time. I feel like every year
she loves Ireland, so I think she comes through once a year, and Ireland loves her from the crowd that knew every word to every song, was standing room only.
Have you listened to Nick Cave's new album yet?
I just started to in the car and realized it's not car music. It is
not car music.
It's being in a cabin and contemplating the universe near a fire kind of music. But
yeah,
I'm a new fan to him. In much the same way I was to Patty. Like, I didn't come to Patty through her music. I mean, I knew her music and I knew it and I sort of appreciated it. I actually seen her perform, but it wasn't until I started reading her prose that I was like, who is this absolute goddess? And now it just all makes sense. And so with Nick, it's sort of the same thing. Like, I knew who he was. I sort of knew his music. I don't necessarily think I was a fan, but through his writing, I'm just like, oh, who is this soul?
Right.
Yeah. And if anybody hasn't read the Red Hand Files, Nick Cave's, like, I don't know if it's weekly. It's not consistent, but he takes letters from fans and he responds, and they're just the most vulnerable, lovely, poetic, beautiful pieces of kind of pastoral counseling in a way.
Yeah. I would have, it's funny, I'm thinking about him because he was Shane McGowan was another one that I would have loved to have tried to have a conversation about these things with, because he was so deeply invested in his Catholic spirituality to the very end. And Nick played at his gorgeous funeral. That's a weird thing to say, but if you haven't seen it and you can find footage of Shane McGowan's funeral mass, do yourself a favor and watch it. It's one of the most extraordinary things. First of all, that like every musician you could think of came to pay tribute and celebrate his life, but it's chaos in the most beautiful Irish McGowan-y kind of sense of the word. But at one point, his wife and his sister jump over the pew and start dancing on the altar in front of his casket, which is a casket. Anyway, so Nick Cave is there. So he's, I think I would really love to have a long conversation with Nick Cave about pretty much anything. Shane McGowan's one. And then I would have loved to have talked to Sinead. I think that would have been a complicated, really interesting. She was so vulnerable, especially later in life. It would have been an honor to sit with her. But
And
That's-
we'll link your Substack because I would say if anybody is a Sinead fan, Kathy, there were so many things written about her after her death. And in my completely unbiased opinion, Kathy wrote the most beautiful piece about her that I think is incredibly resonant. Well, Kath, I have one more question, but I kind of feel like I want to save it and maybe see if we can get you back. And
Sure.
because I feel like the next question kind of goes into something a little different and
maybe a whole new thread.
And that is, and maybe we can talk about this together, is how has our past careers, because Kathy is studying to be a spiritual director. I am a spiritual director, and how your work as a journalist and an interviewer of people, and perhaps maybe me as an actor and a director of people, how that has how we've leveraged that in the work we're trying to do with creating space.
Oh,
for
I'd love to
people.
talk about that. I'd love, because I'm not, I mean, you're doing it and I'm, being trained and contemplating and not really sure what it's going to look like, but that's at the forefront of my mind most days. It's like, and it's after many years of doing one thing or some things very well, and with great love and passion, and having those either stop or go away, or making the decision to pivot. It would be, I would love to talk about that. That's rich. That's a long conversation.
Yeah, we can't do that in 5 minutes.
No. No, speed round. Favorite scripture.
And then Erin can interview us, and we can get Erin's voice in here a little bit more.
By the way, I was
Sorry.
like, we could do a conversation where we actually let Erin say something.
This was amazing. I mean, you're an amazing storyteller. So it was really wonderful just to hear, all these different these stories of your life and experiences that you've had. I think people are going to really like hearing the stories you have to share.
Well, thank you. And it's Kelley and I have been we've interviewed people together, and I think we've been interviewed together, but we've never interviewed each other. And we're having it's like being in, I don't know, it's like a Golden Girls kind of inside the actor studio with two Golden Girls talking to each other who know each other super well.
I love it.
So
I love it.
No, I'd be happy to come back anytime. You know where to find me, sitting here up in the forest. So
awesome. I also want you to, what the other story I want you to tell in that one is the story of getting lost in the woods.
Oh, in Nepal?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
We'll open with that. We'll start with that.
There we go.
And it ties into something that Harold Ramis, he of also blessed memory, told me in my interview in The God Factor.
Yeah.
So I'll come back around.
That's also just kind of crazy looking through that list of people and seeing how many have
left,
have passed. Yeah.
I know. It's kind of heartbreaking. Yeah. But more than anything, I just feel so privileged and blessed. #blessed. To have known some of those people.
Yeah.
So
thanks for sharing.
Thanks for having me. Erin,
thank you so much. It's very nice to meet you.
You too. See you again.
Love you.
Get your ass over here.
Okay. I will.
Love you too.
A huge heartfelt thank you to all of our listeners. Some of you joined us a year ago, some of you joined us recently, but all of you are helping us grow the show. Thank you so much.
Atheist is still advertising free, sponsor free, and available for free to everyone. Lots of podcasts have big production teams. Our team is just 3 friends working together to make something we hope puts good into the world and brings value to your life.
But we always need your help. Please spread the word and share the show. All of our social links and other ways to support the show are available on atheistpodcast.com.
Atheist is produced by Justin Seiwell of Trend Media, STL. Thank you for listening, and keep looking for connection.